So, remember how last week when we talked about Hagane, I so boldly presented it as my third most wanted game? Before I acquired it anyway? Well, this is Run Saber. This is my number one most wanted game. Before I acquired it, obviously. And this is an interesting game because it's something that will forever live in the shadow of something far more famous and well-known. And even though it is its own game in its own right, being in that shadow is not necessarily a bad thing, because that will always mean that even though this game is not very well known, and even though it will probably never get out of that shadow, it will still forever be connected to something amazingly fun. And by proxy, well, you'd hope that a lot of people would know about it, but, the night's still young for this game. Anyway, Run Saber. The best way I can really talk about this game is, you know that game Strider that I love? I reviewed it so long ago. Well, it got a console release on the Sega Genesis, but not on the Super Nintendo. Fortunately, however, there was a solution. Let's make a game that is sort of very much like Strider, but still its own thing, and we'll call it Run Saber. And because it's very similar to Strider, it's something I'm immediately in love with. The plot is basically, the planet Irath is so polluted that it's basically uninhabitable at this point. Many efforts exist to try and clean it up, but, there's a bunch of monsters out there, and the only way to fix this problem now is ninja robots, known as the Run Sabers. And there were 3 devised. The first one was known as Kurtz, and he was the owner of the magical Fire Saber. And I guess he failed his mission or something because he's gone. But you'll probably encounter him a bunch of times over the course of the game. Next is the second Run Saber, Alan, who is equipped with a Lightning Saber. And finally, you have the third Run Saber, Sheena, equipped with the Ice Saber. And this is where this game gets a little bit different than, say, its contemporary Strider. You get to pick your character. I mean, seriously, you can pick between either Alan or Sheena, and while you would think it's just a visual change, there's actually a little bit of functional differences. I mean, first of all, yes, there is the visual change of your character's sprite, as well as the color of their attacks. Alan's is green, whereas Sheena's is blue, trying to emphasize that one has a lightning sword and the other has an ice sword. But in addition, the actual functional use of their sword is a little bit different. Alan's sword actually slashes a little bit longer horizontally, whereas Sheena's slashes a little bit more vertically. That fact alone, plus the fact that she is very clearly just a robotic version of the greatest summoner from the Tales of series ever, who was at one point played by Samus herself, we gotta go with Sheena. And that comparison to Metroid isn't just a fun, quirky little fact about voice actors, although it is very true. There's actually a move in here that is very, very reminiscent of Metroid, because your Run Saber of choice is equipped with a bunch of different abilities, many of which movement-based, which is, first of all, amazing because it means that evasion sort of becomes a dance around ordnance and really just a calculated way to style around your opponents and cut down as many people around you as possible. But it also means you have a lot of options to take out your opponents. Like I said, there's kind of a connection to Metroid here. If you do a jump attack, you've got like 4 different options. First one, and one of my favorite attacks, basically the screw attack. Okay, it's not quite as good as the patented Metroid brand screw attack, as you still have a hitbox inside of that giant hurt box around you, but it does protect you from all sides for the most part, provided you don't overlap your enemy. You also have a dive kick, a straight lunge down, as well as a jumping slash. I just want to point out that is aerial attacks in this game. You've got 4 choices. And on the ground, you've got a few as well. You've got slashing, you've got sliding, you also have a charged up super bomb that you can collect, and they actually drop quite a few of them. However, this super bomb, I felt there was one specific strategy as to how to use it well. Certainly you could use it to clear standard enemies out of your path, but really it just felt better to save up as many as you could and just drop them all on a boss, because some of these bosses are really, really mean. The game itself isn't really all that difficult. There's 1 or 2 moments where it's a little bit frustrating and it could drain your lives, and because it is a limited resource and I am under a limited time frame to put this video out, I did decide to put in an unlimited lives code just to get to the end, because first time I played through this game I could not get past level 3. but there are some definitely tricky bits, but it's nothing too overwhelming. But it's at least fair. You've got a small handful of lives, and if you run out, you've got 3 continues, each with their own handful of lives. So it's basically an extended life bar of sorts, because when you die, you simply respawn where you died, provided you have more lives and continues to continue on from anyway. And I think that's an excellent respawning mechanic. It means that you don't lose too much progress, like say Hagane, where there was absolutely no checkpoints in a level, and it still feels like you're making progress even though you very clearly messed up at that point. So it strikes a nice balance between punishing as well as allowing you to feel like you've made some advancement over your previous run, and that is heavily appreciated. Now, like I said, this game is a lot about movement. Your character has various different movement skills, your attacks all have different movement patterns to it, and it's very well done. There's also a climbing mechanic that allows you to approach how you get around the environment a little bit differently, and the nice thing is some of the levels are actually designed around this mechanic. So it's not a completely throwaway mechanic. It feels like the first and foremost aspect of gameplay is movement, and that's always an interesting thing to see because it means that first of all you can master various different movements, get around the environment and enemies as fast as possible, but it also means that you've got options to try and take on any obstacle, kind of to suit your own battle style, and I love that. The levels in Run Saber are a little bit hit or miss. Don't get me wrong, the levels themselves are actually really fun and they're pretty well designed. For whatever reason, there's like an arrow that tells you where to go, and if you go slightly in the not suggested direction, it spells out you're going the wrong way. Like the giant arrow isn't already telling you enough, and the levels are linear, so it's almost like this is a completely pointless design choice. There's very rarely ever a moment where you're not going to understand where you need to go, so why you'd clutter the UI with this, I'm not entirely sure. And there are some really fun set pieces. I remember running into this one level where you suddenly get the jump on this one mini-boss, and then once you finish the mini-boss, suddenly this entire structure that you've been on turns into this giant death trap and you have to try and like navigate it. And something about that really stuck with me. This game in general just has a ton of really cool set pieces. The first boss is not only on top of a fighter jet, but it is the fighter jet itself. And while the standard enemies are just sort of, you know, whatever, the actual bosses are really bloody creative. Like I mentioned, you're fighting the various aspects of the fighter jet, which, while we're going back a few steps, is basically an entire tutorial on the movement mechanics themselves, because the fighter jet is flipping and spinning in the air and you need to fight the enemy while climbing around and not dying. Seriously, that was a brilliant choice to try and teach people how to actually like move and master their environment. Plus it was a fun boss fight. But before that you have to fight a wall that is just these weird metallic like liquid gynoid shapes just jumping out at you. It was so weird. And then after that you fight like this giant skeleton. There's this one boss that totally reminds me of Seven Force from Gunstar Heroes, because it starts in like this one quadruped form, then turns into a biped, and then turns into like this spider thing that you're constantly like running around and jumping and trying to kill. There's so much movement in these bosses, and the bosses themselves are so creative. I love it. But like I said, the levels do have problems. While they are creative and there are tons of memorable set pieces, there's only 5. And if a game's length is something that really matters to you, that could be seriously disappointing, because, well, there's just not that much. And sure, it's fairly difficult when you start out, to the point where you're probably going to game over a few times before you can even get past level 2, kind of like I did the first time I played this. Once you work your way around what the game expects you to do and how the levels are laid out, it's not a really difficult game or anything. It's really more just about mastering the movement and avoiding attacks, and sometimes avoiding getting ganged up on enemies, because they kind of respawn on you pretty quick. But it's not too big of a deal. But yeah, level design, great, but I just wish there was more of it. It feels almost like the game was rushed just in the fact that there's not more of it, you know? But what this game does, it does well. It's ninjas hacking mutants and like robots and stuff to bits, fighting crazy bosses, and all centered around being the master of your environment. And when that movement and when that environmental mastery really syncs up with you, it is almost sort of zen to play this game. It's really fun. The overall presentation to Run Saber is kind of average though. Don't get me wrong, like I said, the bosses are amazingly creative and just incredibly memorable. I love the bosses in this game. But the standard enemies, while some of them are kinda cool, they're not the most interesting, and while a lot of the set pieces are fairly memorable themselves, again, you've only got about 5. They're pretty much all post-apocalyptic. There's one that takes place in the forest, which is a little bit different, and there's one that looks like it jumps straight out of H.R. Geiger's brain, but, you know, they're not the most memorable environments. Once you get past some of the cool set pieces, some of the backgrounds are just kind of bland and not all that interesting. But I do think the bosses and the experience this game provides are totally what the focus of the actual game was, and not necessarily the visuals. Or the music, because the music is there. I mean, it's relatively fast-paced, but there's, again, very few actual tracks in this game, and there's not a lot that are really all that particularly amazing. In fact, offhandedly, the only song I can really think of that made me think, oh, I like this song, was the final boss theme, which was kind of fast-paced and pulse-pounding, and it just sort of fit what this game was trying to do. But like everything else, it feels like there just could be more, and it could be refined a little bit better, you know? Like I said a second ago with the visuals, I think the actual gameplay itself was the focus here, so it's not great, but I'd say the overall presentation is average. But it does have its high points, and those high points are really, really high points. Now, if you want a copy of Run Saber on the Super Nintendo, cheapest one I'm seeing right now, shipping included, is $110. Wow. That's pretty surprising. When I first learned of this game, I kind of immediately wanted a copy, and I kind of sort of pushed it away and put it on the back burner, but that was about maybe 5 years ago, and that game was $25, maybe $30 back then. This game has just ballooned in price, but I also did not pay for this. Like Hagane and the next couple games, this was a game I traded my wonderful girlfriend for, and God, this game is so cool. It feels like it could be a lot longer, and it's probably not necessarily the most memorable thing ever, but man, Run Saber is an absolute blast to play. This might be one of the best SNES games I've played this year. Honestly, I wish it were longer. I wish it did a little bit more that was unique, and it was certainly a lot more refined in, well, pretty much all respects, except perhaps movement, although the jumps are a wee bit floaty. But Run Saber is pretty excellent, and honestly, if you can get it for a fair price, I would say grab it, especially if you're a fan of Strider and you have a Super Nintendo, because, I mean, there was no Strider on the Super Nintendo, unfortunately. This was the thing that fills the gap. And what's really surprising about this game is that it is an absolute blast to play, and yet so few people know about this. And I have no idea why. Oh, okay, fair enough, I do know why. It's been sitting its entire life in the shadows of something far more refined and far more famous in Strider, and yet, it's really damn good. In fact, you would think the fact that it sat in the shadow of Strider, it would be better known just because it's that game that is, hey, you like Strider? Try this game. Or hey, you like Strider but you don't have a Genesis? This is the game for you. But no one knows about this game, and the fact that it's increasing in price and I guess getting rarer, although it might have been rare to begin with, it means this game is just going to exist forever in obscurity, and that's a damn shame because Run Saber is an absolute treat to play. Yes, it has its down points, the presentation isn't necessarily the most stellar outside of the bosses, and the sound is kind of not worth mentioning at all, really. But you know, Run Saber is a game that gets it right where it counts, the gameplay, and I think this is a must-have if you like arcadey platforming games on the Super Nintendo. If you love Strider, you need this game in your life, and it's fantastic. The one drawback to it is, of course, its cost. But if you think this game looks interesting and you don't have, you know, the $100 or so this game now costs, maybe go try Strider. You can find that game on a bunch of different compilations, as well as on the Genesis, which is a relatively good port. But I think, if nothing else, we can all agree this game is a hell of a lot better than Strider 2 on the Genesis. That game was just... no. That game was trying to be Strider, and it failed in pretty much every attempt. But like its name suggests, Run Saber dashed its way into my heart and slashed away any doubts I had about it. This game is awesome.